To begin the story, it didn't take long for me to realize what a fool I'd been. I got into a relationship with one of the most selfish beings to ever exist in the whole wide world, and somehow I was completely blinded to it. She had called me whenever she needed anything, and I always answered without any questions or delays. Whenever she was in any kind of trouble, I was her go-to guy, her problem solver. It didn't matter if it was late in the middle of the night or during the day at work hours. I was always there for her, no matter what. When she needed someone to talk to, I was there. When she needed someone to complain to about how difficult and sad her life was, I was also there. I never once ignored or procrastinated anything she asked me for. She was the complete opposite of what I was to her, and somehow I didn't notice it. I stayed in the relationship like a blindfolded dog, simply trusting its owner. Every time I tried to talk about my problems, she always had a way of making the conversation about her. It didn't matter what it was I was feeling or how it affected me. She always found a way to turn everything into a discussion about her, and I just let myself be dragged along by her endless stream of self-centered problems and concerns. I didn't even realize that I was starting to ignore myself and what I felt till the day I caught her cheating. It all happened like a bad movie. I was caught right in the middle of the night. I was supposed to be out on a business meeting in North Dakota, but my flight got canceled because of a stormy cloud. I wanted to call and tell her I was coming back home, but then I decided to surprise her and make a romantic night out of it. I didn't come to the airport with a car, so I had an Uber to drive me home. I bought a bouquet from the airport before hopping onto my ride home. The driver was slow on the pedals due to the weather, and the traffic. A huge storm had hit the town, and it made it visibly impossible to see. I wasn't in a hurry to get home, so I didn't mind. Better be safe than sorry. Eventually, the Uber pulled up to my apartment, and all of a sudden, I noticed a black BMW parked in my driveway, which was strange because my wife's car was in the garage when I left, and so was mine. Neither of us had black BMWs either. I didn't want to think anything of the car, so I simply ignored it, thinking that maybe one of her friends or family members had come to visit her. I made my way into the apartment. I didn't find my wife in the living room, which was just as well because I wanted to surprise her. But I found 2 wine glasses and a briefcase on the coffee table. First the BMW parked out front, and now a briefcase on the coffee table. I kept my briefcase next to the one on the table and slowly made my way upstairs. I didn't want to think of it, but my brain was already putting 2 and 2 together. I pushed open my bedroom door to find my wife lying asleep in bed with some random stranger's arms wrapped around her waist. She had her bare breast on his chest, and her legs were intertwined under the sheets. I felt a sudden rush of blood to my head as I took in the picture in front of me. The ground beneath my feet seemed to move a little bit, and I found myself falling on my knees. I didn't want to believe what was right in front of me, but I knew there was no one seeing what I just saw. I trusted her with everything I had and gave her all my attention. My whole life was centered around her, and I believed in my heart that she wouldn't cheat on me. And yet here we were, my wife and another man, sleeping in my bed with another man's arms around my wife. My head was throbbing and spinning at the same time. I tried to speak, but all that came out was a choked whimper. The sound of my voice caused them both to stir awake, and they both looked at me with wide eyes. I could see the fear in their eyes, and I couldn't help but feel guilty for being the cause of it. I stood up and walked towards the door. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. I slowly dragged myself downstairs to the kitchen and pulled out a bottle of whiskey from the liquor cabinet. I pulled myself a glass and gulped the whole thing down in seconds. My throat felt completely numb to the burning sensation of the whiskey as it rushed down my throat. "Simon," I heard my wife call out in a low tone. I turned around to find her standing in front of me with a small box of clothes and the strange man standing behind her. She looked like she was genuinely sad, but I couldn't even care how sad she was at that moment. My heart was shattered into a million pieces. and her sudden decision to leave with a strange man I caught was just a stomping on the broken fragments that remained. We stared at each other. Wordlessly, finally, she broke the silence. "I'm sorry, Simon. I hope you can forgive me," she said before leaving with the man, following closely behind her. I drank myself into his sanity for 2 days in a row before I finally calmed down enough to come back to reality and realize that drinking wasn't a healthy way to handle the pain. I felt I decided to go back to the way I used to be before I got into the relationship that now a bane to my existence. I used to love playing piano, video games, and watching films, but she made me stop when we got married. I pulled out my phone and started looking for things to distract myself. I went on a buying spree. I went to a mall and spent $2,000 on a bunch of random games, ones I wasn't even interested in. But I knew, as long as I didn't complain and complete them, my mind would be off her. I started searching Craigslist for anyone who had any decent games to sell. I wanted to get things off my mind, and I went on crazy buying sprees at the end of it. I must have ordered at least 30 games, all of which probably take a whole year or two just to complete. I searched for a few minutes before I found one that I wanted to add to the collection. So I got in touch with the seller and paid for it. I was told to wait a bit. He wanted me to come the next day to have it delivered, but I didn't have the patience for that. I asked for the seller's address, and he was more than happy to give it to me. I drove for an hour and 40 minutes to get to the house, but when I called, no one answered the phone. I remember being stood outside of the property on the driveway, trying to get a hold of him. No one was answering the phone, and there didn't seem to be any lights on inside. I got out of the car and walked up to the door, and then called again. I could hear the phone ring inside of the house, but there was still no answer. I thought, maybe the guy was asleep, so I tried to knock on the door. There was still no reply. I started walking all around the house, and then tried to make sure that it was definitely the right address he had sent me on Craigslist. As I opened up my web browser on my phone, I had 1 bar of signal, barely enough to even view the messages or the inbox. Thankfully, though, it did load after 5 minutes of standing there, trying to refresh the chat box. Sure enough, it was the right address. But for some reason, the guy wasn't here, or at least he was pretending not to be. It was dark and late evening, and I was starting to get hungry. My hair was a mess, and I just released 10 years worth of stress hormones into my bloodstream by seeing my wife cheat on me that very same evening. I had now been to the mall and walked around. I was exhausted from all the pacing around. I could feel my heart. It started to hurt a little. Maybe heartbreak does really hurt, and it's not just all spiritual. I never truly believed in it, but as I stood there on the guy's front porch, it was seriously feeling bad. I knocked one last time. I decided that before I left, I would look through some of the windows to try and see what was going on. Some of the windows were open, but the smaller ones at the top. It's not like I was about to break in for video games. Well, I had nothing to lose at this point, so I did consider it. As I was walking around the house, I noticed that there was in fact a light on, but it was from one of the inside rooms. I could see it by looking through one of the outer rooms. It was very faint, and seemed to be an orange-type bulb. It was glowing and illuminating the inside of the house, so the corridor and then the stairs leading upstairs. As I looked all around each window, I noticed that I could see something on the floor in the corridor, being lit up by the hall light. My eyesight's not great, and for driving, reading, and watching TV or gaming, I wear glasses. At this point, my glasses were tucked under my collar, so I pulled them out and placed them over my eyes. That's when I realized the figure I was looking at on the floor was a man's body lying in the middle of the hallway. All of a sudden, what went from feeling stressed for the rest of that 4 hours turned into panic. It's a miracle that I didn't have a heart attack that day. But maybe it was so I could save that man. The next thing I did was went to the back of my truck. I grabbed a hammer and smashed the back of the window in. I keep tools in the back of my truck for instances like helping my dad build stuff, and my brother also has a fencing company. I used to be an apprentice for him as he's 10 years older than me. I've always kept trusty tools and especially a pocket knife. You never know when things like this will come in handy. Once I had smashed this guy's window, I climbed through it, trying to avoid the smashed glass and the bits that was still left on the frame. It must have taken me another few minutes just to get into the property, at which point I noticed this smell coming from inside. It didn't smell good at all. It smelled rancid, and I had to peg my own nose with my finger and thumb to stop myself from vomiting up my guts, which I have done plenty that night considering all the whiskey I'd drunk. My throat was still stinging and burning like mad. I slowly made my way to the corridor, where I saw this man's body still laying still. I got over to him and tried to find a pulse, but I couldn't find any then. I went over and tried to check if he was breathing by placing my cheek near his mouth. Sure enough, I could feel a faint bit of air puffing every few seconds into my cheek. That was my signal to go and call the cops. Now the dispatcher sent 3 ambulances and 2 police cars when they turned up. They didn't do CPR. They didn't do any type of defibrillator. They simply just took him away on a stretcher. I don't know what happened to this guy, but it was the guy selling the games. And the fact that he had this happen to him, and the fact that I was on the way within the hour, that it happened genuinely shows that maybe there is miracles. I was having one of the worst days of my life, and arguably, so was he. But I guess you could say it was kind of balanced out. Yin and yang. I saved his life as a result of my decision to be stubborn and come and pick up the game. I didn't actually care about the game anymore. I realized how important life was, and seeing an almost dead guy in front of me made me really reconsider my life. Am I really going to get that stressed over my ex-wife? No, not anymore. Since then I moved on. The man met with me one more time. We're not really friends as we live so far apart, but he thanked me. He hugged me tight, and I could tell it meant a lot to him. By the time I turned 18, it was it. I wanted out of my house. My entire childhood had been spent basically arguing with my mom and my stepdad, and I didn't get on with them either. It was a big issue for me, but most mornings, I wouldn't want to go to school. They would have to fight me there, and the whole family in general was just dysfunctional. It stressed me out, and my parents always went on and on about as soon as I turned 18, they would kick me out of the house. I know I didn't think they were being serious, but at the same time, a part of me wanted them to be. So you're probably wondering where Craigslist joins into all this. When I turned 18, they gave me a few weeks to find my own place. Now at the time, I was working part-time at Subway, and I didn't really have any education because I didn't want to. I was trying to get into the art route, and I liked creating my own pencil drawings, some of which I managed to actually sell online. It was tough though. The competition was super high, and I reckon the market was saturated with just so much artwork. I kept at it though, and although I hated my part-time job at Subway, it paid my way. It managed to get me groceries and so on. However, that salary would soon be extremely stretched once I had to find my own place. So my parents can't wait to get rid of me, and I can't really wait to leave them. I don't know what it's like to have a good relationship with your parents, and I almost envy those people that are listening to this story who's actually having a good relationship with theirs. I do miss the idea and wonder it would have been like, and I don't know why we just didn't get along. Perhaps it was because I didn't like my stepdad, and I felt like my mom didn't marry him for love, but more for money. Anyway, that's a whole nother story. So one evening, I was scouring the internet trying to find somewhere to rent. So basically, I was 18 years old, and I was a girl, so I needed safety, but I also needed it cheap. My part-time salary at Subway wasn't great. It was actually minimum wage, practically, so I needed somewhere super cheap. So I knew that I needed either a single room or a shared accommodation. My best bet was Craigslist. So I went on the criteria list and ticked the things I thought would be helpful and what I'd been looking for. Eventually, I came up with a whole bunch of shared accommodation and house shares. It seemed pretty cool at the time, and even some of them were girls only, meaning there would be no guys there. I wasn't exactly scared of guys, but I never had a relationship until this point, and I wasn't really ready for one, either considering what I'd been through with my family and all of the issues I had. Going forward, I looked through some of the ads. Some looked pretty cool, some looked outright dreadful. Some of the living conditions were awful, but considering my price criteria was cheap, and when I say cheap, I mean really cheap. At the time, we were talking about $500 to $800 per month. This was a cheap criteria setting, that all of the worst ones came up from my area. It's not exactly a bad area, so it's just a case of me trying to leave the town, slightly to go out into the cheaper areas. But by doing this, I need to take the bus back to my job every day. Anyway, so I come across this advert, and I think it's the one for me. The only female shared house, and a landlord is looking to have an open day where he invites anyone to come along and take a look around the property. So apparently, they're up to 8 rooms, and it's a house that's pretty impressive, considering sharing means we'll have the bathrooms, the kitchen, the living area, and even the big garden all to share. Now granted, I got along with these girls. I think it would be pretty cool, but I never actually had a peaceful living situation until this point in my life. Considering practically from the age I was born, I was not getting along with my parents at all. So the house sharing viewing was around 2 weeks after I had looked at this advert. So I wrote it in the calendar and set a reminder on my phone. Couldn't wait for this, and I updated my parents and let them know just to keep them happy. Just to show them that I was actually planning and something was going ahead with me moving out. When the time came, I drove down and I found myself gathering around outside a pretty good looking house for around 10 to 20 minutes. Let's say, as those 10 to 20 minutes pass, it just so happens I was the only person outside the house. Eventually around 8, other girls did turn up, so I guess it was 1 per room, or maybe there was just 9 of us. I don't know where the 9th girl was going to sleep, considering the guys said there was only 8 bedrooms. When we rock up there, eventually he's not there. I'm the only one there at a sidewalk, so I decided just to sit in my parked car. Kind of awkward, but I just pretend I'm like doing some work or writing something down. And as I remember rightfully, I was actually just drawing on my notepad. Eventually, we're like 15 minutes late into the time we're supposed to be viewing, and people start turning up. The guy also rocks up. He looks like an average looking guy, maybe in his mid-30s. He turned up in some jeans and some builder's boots, so clearly he's like into property, I guess, or he was just trying to flip his house in the rental market. He seemed like that typical guy with a cap on his head and open shirt, which was undone with a t-shirt underneath it. So if you guys can picture this, so the girls began checking up on the front of the door, just hanging around, but the majority weren't. If I remember, it was only 2 girls. They were all around my age, but I couldn't quite tell the youngest. You're allowed to apply if you're 18. I was right at the limit, but the oldest I think went up to 25 or 26. Eventually I decided to get out of the car and muster up the courage and take a deep breath to go and approach this group. They didn't seem too bad. I shook their hands and introduced myself, learned a bit about each other, and the usual small talk about how nervous we were during this whole time. The landlord and the owner of the property didn't even come to say hi. When I saw him walk on the sidewalk, he actually ignored all the girls, walked through the backyard, and must have gone in through a door around the back of the house. So this was my first suspicious thing about this guy. I mean, okay, fine, he doesn't have to make the introduction on the way in, I guess. He wanted to go through the back. Maybe he just wanted to prepare the house quickly, or he had a few things laid out that he needed to get rid of. Who knows? So anyway, he opens the front door. We're all stood there. This is like half an hour late by this point, so we're pretty annoyed. Now, I wasn't working this particular day. It was Friday, and I had the Friday off, so it was no big deal. I had time to kill. The guy opens the door, and he's super enthusiastic. So he must have been around 5'10", 5'11", and like I said, with his jeans and boots and shirt on, and his cap. And he has one of his friends there. So the whole time, there was actually someone inside the house. Anyway, long story short, he walks us around to all the different rooms. He gives us a mini house tour, shows us all the bathrooms, the kitchen, what we can use, what we can't use, etc. The living room, the TV is pretty nice, and I was looking forward to it. The girls seemed genuine, but as they say, never judge a book by its cover. We'd known each other for about 10 minutes, so I was still being, withheld within myself. And eventually, The guide breaks it to us that the living arrangement on the ad in Craigslist wasn't actually exactly what it is. So we were a bit confused, and me and the other two girls asking what he's on about. So it turns out this is his house, which we all knew he owned. The house, however, it turns out it's his only house, and that he will be living with us. So immediately, this is a red flag to me, and some of the other girls. Some of the girls actually accept it, however, and just brush it off, but I think deep down they were also a bit creeped out. So the guy immediately laying out the rules. Number 1, we can't have any guys or bring any guys back. Another red flag. Number 2, he says that we have to be back by a certain time every evening. This is another red flag. And red flag after red flag, I start to begin to think I made the wrong decision coming here. So I'm stood there with these other girls, and we're in the living room at this point. He's just broken the bad news to us, or to me anyway, that he will be now living with us 24/7, and that he says he wants no other guys in the house, and that we all must be home by a certain time every evening, even if we have to work a job that evening. So to me, that's two major red flags right away. Living with my parents who I didn't get along with, I was pretty equipped at getting used to noticing red flags, especially when it came to people I had to live with. Initially, this guy came across as completely normal, even after these two red flags, but the next stage of this tour shook me and freaked me out big time. So he started getting super relaxed, he started even complimenting some of the girls and flirting with them, and then eventually he went on to say that he actually didn't care if we ran around in our underwear, and there's no rules as to what we have to wear around the house. Outside of our rooms, not only did this make no sense, but I thought it's none of his business what we wear. Granted, we don't just walk around the house naked, which I guess that's common sense and logic, right? But this guy's bringing up that we could just walk around the house wearing whatever we wanted. To me, that was the third red flag, and I was ready to make an excuse to get the hell out of there, or just pretend that I was going to actually pay the rent, but never actually turn up. I was trying to think of excuses, and I didn't quite know what to do or say at that point. It all lasted around 15 minutes, and this guy was creeping me out every minute that went on. Some of the other girls were also agreeing with me, and giving me funny looks as if to say, "Do you really want to do this?" We could tell that this guy was literally just trying to exploit women, and use them because he owned this. The fact that this ad said women only, the fact he wants us to wear whatever we like, whether it be half naked around the house, but he wants no men to be brought back, and on top of all this, that he wants us back at a set time every evening. That included with all the flirting was enough for me to say enough is enough. I decided to tell him that I had to leave, considering we were late with the tour and I planned to meet somebody after. So I turned around and bid farewell, and I said that I would note or text him whether I was actually wanting to do this, and I knew deep down I wasn't ever going to do this. Eventually I managed to find a decent place on my own, but I did have two other housemates. It was a small flat with 3 separate bedrooms. It was cheaper, and our landlord wasn't creepy. So be careful with Craigslist ads, and the landlords who rent out their properties. You don't know what they have in common, or what they have planned for you. Thanks everybody for listening. I'm sorry I haven't been posting for a while. I was just on vacation and was dealing with some family issues. With that said, I hope you guys enjoyed the stories. If you did, please leave a like, comment, or subscribe. And if you want stories for me to narrate, please leave them down where the link is in the description. Thank you, and as always, stay depraved.